The aroma of rosemary chicken and warm bread filled the room, but the tension simmering in the air was stronger. My daughter-in-law, Melissa, stood frozen, her manicured hand clutching the edge of the kitchen counter like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Around her, the rest of my family had gone silent, the conversation dying mid-sentence as Melissa's voice echoed again. She is $22 million. Her words didn't make sense to them at first, not until she turned her phone around and showed the banking app one had accidentally left open. The screen glowed with the unmistakable numbers, digits too long to be anything modest. I felt every eye in the room swing toward me, and I stood there, holding a tray of deviled eggs, suddenly the center of a storm I hadn't seen coming. "Mom," my son, Ethan, asked, his voice tight, eyes sharp with disbelief. His wife's eyes flicked from the phone to my face, then to the others, a predator who'd found a secret too good to keep. My heart pounded, and my hands trembled, but I didn't move. I simply set the tray down as gently as I could and braced myself for the avalanche I knew was coming. If you have a similar story about betrayal from the people you least expect, tell us in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. "How long have you had this money, Mom?" Ethan's voice had lost all affection, replaced by something businesslike, almost cold. My other son, Darren, straightened in his chair, no longer pretending to listen to his own daughter talk about school. The dining room that had always echoed with laughter and bickering now pulsed with suspicion and greed. My sister, Lorraine, raised an eyebrow, her fork midair, eyes narrowing like a hawk watching a mouse dart from a hole. My nieces whispered to each other across the table, their eyes lighting up with curiosity and calculation. I stood at the edge of the table, the matriarch they had always overlooked, now transformed into something else, a puzzle they were determined to solve. "It's real?" Darren asked, clearly hoping for denial, or at least a story he could dismantle. I swallowed hard, then nodded once. "It's real." That was all I said, but it was more than enough. Melissa's jaw dropped open in theatrical disbelief, like she couldn't believe I had kept such a thing from her. "How could you keep this a secret?" she demanded, her tone sharper now, eyes narrowing with fresh resentment. "You live in a tiny cottage, you drive that rusty old Honda, you never spend a dime on yourself," she continued, listing each frugality like it was a personal betrayal. I didn't answer right away, because I knew no explanation would satisfy them. The truth was simple, but not the kind of simple they respected. "I didn't think it was anyone's business," I said finally, knowing it would enrage them. And it did. Darren's wife, Colleen, rolled her eyes and scoffed. "Not anyone's business? We're your family." Ethan leaned forward, elbows on the table like he was preparing for a negotiation. "Where did it come from, Mom?" he asked, voice like a blade. "This doesn't make sense. Are you involved in something?" The question felt like a slap, and I staggered inwardly from the force of it. "Involved in something?" I repeated, stunned by how fast they were willing to doubt me. My family, who had eaten the meals I made, who dropped off their kids when they wanted free babysitting, who had called only when they needed something. They didn't know anything about me beyond what was convenient for them to assume. And now that I didn't fit the box they had assigned me, they were unraveling. "I worked," I said calmly, my voice firmer now, rooted in truth. "I worked hard, saved carefully, and made a few good choices." Lorraine snorted like that explanation wasn't good enough. "You made good choices and ended up with 22 million, she said with a scoff, her voice coated in disbelief. "Come on, be serious." But I was being serious, more serious than I had been in years. They couldn't wrap their minds around it because I had never let them see who I really was. To them, I had always been the quiet widow who clipped coupons and served food with a smile. I had been invisible, background noise in their lives, someone they didn't bother to question or understand. They saw the sweaters I wore until they frayed, the furniture I never replaced, and assumed poverty. But I wasn't poor, not in spirit, not in mind, and certainly not in finance. The truth was, I had learned long ago that power lived in silence, in knowing things others didn't. I had studied investing in secret, listened to audiobooks on economics while I gardened, read books about real estate while I waited in parking lots. Every dollar I saved was a seed I planted, quietly, stubbornly, with more patience than they knew I had. And now the tree had borne fruit, but they didn't see the roots, only the harvest. They didn't see me, not really. They never had. Melissa stepped forward like she was staging an intervention, her voice syrupy but laced with steel. Mom, if you've really had this money, it's time to talk about what comes next. I tilted my head, pretending to misunderstand. What do you mean, what comes next? You know what I mean, she said, arms folded tightly, mouth tight with practiced concern. You're not getting any younger, and this changes everything. We need to talk about your will and your allocations. I raised my eyebrows, trying not to laugh at how quickly the word "we" had replaced you. Ethan nodded solemnly, as if this was a conversation about responsibility, not ambition. Darren stayed quiet, but his eyes gleamed in a way that reminded me of gamblers sizing up a fresh mark. Even Lorraine chimed in, "Don't be stubborn. This isn't the time for secrets." I felt their hands clawing at something I hadn't even offered. You think because we're blood you're entitled, I said, not loudly, but clearly enough that they all heard. They froze, unsure how to respond, because none of them had expected me to push back. I had never confronted them before, had always bowed my head and smiled, even when they were careless or cruel. I never asked you for anything, I continued, but now that you've seen a number, suddenly I'm a vault that needs to be cracked open. That's not fair, Mom, Ethan said, but his voice lacked conviction. We just want to understand, Colleen added, her voice coated in the sweet poison of manipulation. There's nothing to understand, I said, lifting my chin. It's my money, earned and grown with my choices, my sacrifices. They blinked, processing a version of me they had never seen, the version that didn't cower, didn't apologize. For the first time, I saw something like fear in their eyes. They weren't afraid of me. Not really. They were afraid of what I represented now. Independence. Power. Autonomy. Things they hadn't associated with the woman who baked cookies and watched their kids. Now I was a wild card in their carefully constructed inheritance fantasies, a deviation from the script. They were already rewriting their plans, scrambling to realign themselves to the new reality. We just don't want you to make mistakes, Melissa said, trying to sound gentle. Sometimes people your age, well, they're vulnerable to bad decisions. There it was, the angle. My age. My supposed fragility. A justification for why they should be the ones to guide my hand. I laughed then, soft and short, but enough to make Melissa's expression tighten. Vulnerable? I said. You think because I'm 68, I've suddenly lost the ability to think? No one answered. I'm not the one who just found out their whole retirement plan depended on someone else's money, I added. That one hit its mark and Darren winced, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Melissa started to say something, but I cut her off with a raised hand. Let me be very clear, I said. Just because I have money doesn't mean it's yours. The silence that followed was louder than any shouting could have been. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. Lorraine leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowed like she was seeing me for the first time. Well, aren't you full of surprises, she muttered, stabbing at her salad with a force that made the fork clink against the plate. Darren cleared his throat and looked toward Ethan, clearly waiting for him to take control of the situation. But Ethan was quiet, his gaze fixed on the tablecloth like it held answers to the questions he didn't want to ask. Melissa, never one to tolerate silence, crossed her arms and said, So what now? Are you just going to keep it all hidden away in the bank? Her tone was meant to provoke me, to make me feel guilty for not offering. But I didn't bite. I had been guilt-tripped for decades, and I knew this game by heart. Yes, I said simply, I plan to do exactly what I want with my money. Colleen scoffed under her breath, clearly unimpressed. Unbelievable, she muttered, and Lorraine finally set her fork down with a heavy clink. The room, once filled with the hum of reunion, had become a battlefield. It was Darren who spoke next, trying to take a more diplomatic route. Mom, maybe we're all just a little shocked. It's not every day someone you think you know turns out to be sitting on a small fortune. He forced a laugh, but it came out strained, almost sour. You've always been frugal. We just assumed you didn't have much, you know. He was trying to soften it, but I knew what he meant. They all thought I had nothing because I never flaunted anything. I never said I was poor, I replied, pouring myself a glass of water. You all just assumed it, and it suited you to keep thinking that way. Melissa rolled her eyes and leaned forward again. Don't make this about us, Margaret. This is about honesty. You hid this for how long? Almost 20 years, I answered, and the admission sucked the oxygen out of the room. Ethan blinked in disbelief, mouth slightly open like he hadn't expected a number so large. You've had millions for 20 years, he asked, voice rising, the edge of anger creeping in. Yes, I said calmly, watching their faces twist with the realization that I had outsmarted them for 2 decades. Started with a small inheritance from my grandmother. She left me a few $1,000s and a plot of land in northern Vermont. Darren's eyes lit up at the mention of land. I sold the land at the right time, invested the proceeds in stocks, and learned the market slowly. They stared at me like I had just admitted to robbing a bank. I didn't win the lottery, I said. I just paid attention while you were busy ignoring me. Lorraine looked like she was chewing nails, her pride wounded more than anything. But you never told anyone, Colleen said, her tone accusatory, her words brittle. Not even Ethan. Your own son. Ethan looked at me like I had betrayed him, but I saw through the act. It wasn't betrayal he felt, it was loss. Loss of the image he had of me, the predictable and quiet mother who existed only to support him. You never asked, I said gently but firmly. In all your visits, in all your phone calls, you never once asked what I was doing with my time. Darren looked down, perhaps remembering the time I tried to show him a real estate book and he laughed in my face. Besides, what difference would it have made if I had told you? You weren't interested in me, only what I could do for you. That stung, I knew it did, but it was the truth. This gathering, I continued, was supposed to be a celebration of Ethan's promotion, not a tribunal. Ethan's cheeks flushed at the reminder, but Melissa waved it away. That was before you dropped a nuclear bomb on us, Margaret. How do you expect us to pretend like everything's normal now? I tilted my head. I don't. The truth settled into the center of the table like a heavy centerpiece no one wanted to touch. Lorraine, never one to miss a chance to escalate, said, if you're sitting on that kind of money, we have a right to talk about your estate plan. Do you? I asked, and she faltered, not expecting resistance. You have no children, she shot back. It's only right that your nieces and nephews be considered. Oh, you're concerned now? I said, feeling something inside me harden. Where was this concern when I was recovering from surgery last year, and none of you even called? They fell silent again, some looking away, some just staring, blinking in awkward discomfort. I stood up slowly, not to leave, but to let my voice carry further across the long table. I am not your backup plan. I am not your emergency fund. I am not the family piggy bank you get to crack open when life doesn't go your way. I scanned their faces one by one, measuring their guilt, their greed, their shock. You want to talk about what's fair? Let's talk about how I watched your kids when you went on vacations, free of charge. How I baked birthday cakes, paid for camps, and helped with bills when jobs were lost. Melissa shifted uncomfortably, probably remembering the envelope of cash I handed her that Christmas without being asked. I did those things because I loved you. Not because I expected repayment, and certainly not because I owed it to you. I took a deep breath, feeling something lift from my chest. But that doesn't mean you get to claim what's mine. Mom, Ethan said quietly, we're not trying to steal from you. I turned to him, the boy I had once carried in my arms, now a man who had forgotten how to see me. Aren't you? I asked, my voice steady. You see a number, and suddenly I'm a different person in your eyes. Darren opened his mouth, but said nothing, no words coming that could smooth over the jagged edge of my truth. Would you still love me if I had nothing? I asked, though I knew the answer. If I was still driving that old Honda and clipping coupons, would you still want me around? Melissa didn't respond, which told me more than any denial could have. I didn't ask to be rich, I said, quieter now, but I do ask to be respected. Colleen shifted in her chair, clearly uncomfortable with a conversation that didn't end in her benefit. The children in the living room had gone silent too, their laughter replaced by the awareness that something serious was unfolding in the dining room. Even little Maddie, who never stopped humming, sat wide-eyed behind the corner wall, trying to eavesdrop. I sat back down slowly, still watching them all, wondering which would break first. Lorraine, predictably, recovered her voice first, though her tone was laced with a bitterness that coated every word. So, what's the plan then, Margaret? You take it all to your grave. I smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't invite warmth, but certainty. Maybe, I said. Or maybe I build something better with it, something none of you even considered. Their silence, finally, was not from shock, but from the dawning realization that I meant every word. I didn't owe them a single cent, and they were beginning to understand that. Darren leaned forward, his elbows creaking the table as he folded his hands together like he was praying. Look, Mom. I get it, he said, softening his voice as if that would change the words. You feel betrayed, maybe used, maybe invisible, but that's not what this is about. His tone had shifted into something rehearsed, like he'd seen it in a TED Talk or corporate seminar. We just want to make sure you're okay, and that your legacy is, handled responsibly. His eyes flicked quickly toward Ethan, then Melissa, a silent alliance forming in real time. It's not about taking control, it's about protecting what you've built. I smiled faintly, recognizing the tactic for what it was, manipulation dressed as concern. My legacy? I repeated, watching his face twitch with unease. My legacy is not a number in a bank account, I said, pausing to let it sting. My legacy is everything you all chose not to see. Lorraine sighed loudly, clearly done with playing nice. Well, this is ridiculous, she snapped, pushing her chair back just enough to screech across the floor. If you're going to sit here and martyr yourself, then what was the point of inviting us all? I invited you for a family meal, I said, calmly lifting my glass. Not to be audited by relatives who only care now that there's something to gain. Lorraine's eyes flashed, and for a second, I saw the girl I grew up with, prideful, sharp, and always ready for a fight. You think we don't care? She said, voice rising like steam from a kettle. You think we only came for the food? No, I replied, setting my glass down gently. I think you came for whatever you thought you could take. That shut her up, but only for a moment. Melissa was next to speak, standing now, her fingers wrapped tightly around her wine glass. This is going off the rails, she said, casting a dramatic glance around the table. We're your family, Margaret. This doesn't have to be so adversarial. Her words were measured, careful, like she was auditioning for sympathy. You could do so much good, help us all find stability. You've seen the market, the job outlook. Inflation's crushing us. You don't think I've felt inflation? I asked, arching an eyebrow. You don't think I've stretched every dollar since your husband was in diapers? Melissa pursed her lips, trying not to let the insult show, but I knew it hit her pride. I worked in a bookstore 6 days a week while my joints screamed and my fingers cracked open from shelving hardcovers, I added. And I did it with a smile, because no one ever asked me what I wanted. Ethan finally stood, exhaling loudly, his face tense with something between frustration and disbelief. Okay, enough, he said, rubbing his temples like he could massage away the mess we'd all become. This is out of hand, we came here to celebrate, and now we're fighting over hypothetical inheritances like a bunch of strangers. He looked at me with the kind of exasperation that once melted me, back when he was 10 and scraped his knees. Mom, I love you, but you blindsided us. You dropped this like a bomb and now you're acting like we're the villains. I stared at him, the child I had rocked through fevers, who used to fall asleep on my lap during storms. And what were you expecting me to do, Ethan? Write you checks while you clapped politely. His expression tightened, and his voice dropped. That's not fair. Neither is watching your own mother become a stranger to you because she had the audacity to succeed. For a long, drawn-out minute, no one spoke. The sound of the clock ticking over the mantel was suddenly loud, like it was taunting the silence. One of the toddlers in the other room started to cry, but no one moved to check on them. We were all too busy measuring the space between us, wondering when it had become so wide. Colleen finally got up, muttering something about checking on the kids, but I knew it was just an excuse to leave the tension. Darren rubbed the back of his neck like the weight of the room had settled there. Melissa sat back down, wine glass still gripped like a lifeline, while Lorraine tapped her fingers on the table. Ethan remained standing, his eyes darting between me and the bank app still glowing faintly on Melissa's phone. "You know they'll never forget this, right?" he said quietly, as if that would move me. "I hope they don't," I answered. For once, I'm being remembered for something other than being useful. The food on the table had long gone cold, and no one had touched the roasted vegetables or my homemade pie. I looked at the spread, at the candles I had lit with care, at the place cards I had handwritten that morning. It had been meant to be a celebration, not for my wealth, but for Ethan's promotion, a small moment of joy in a year that had felt heavy. But that celebration had been devoured by their entitlement before we even sat down. All of them, except the children, had already calculated what they believed I owed them. Not in kindness, not in attention, but in numbers and zeros. I had been demoted in their eyes, no longer mother, sister, aunt, or grandma, but opportunity. And now the room felt haunted by what they thought they deserved. "Do you even hear yourselves?" I asked, my voice cracking just a little. "You talk about me like I'm gone already." Colleen returned with her youngest in her arms, who looked sleepy and confused by the tension still hanging in the air. "We should probably go," she said, not meeting my eyes. "It's late, and the kids need rest." Darren nodded and stood, brushing imaginary lint off his pants, avoiding my gaze. Melissa looked like she wanted to protest, but knew better than to fight a battle already lost. Ethan didn't move, though he lingered, staring at me like I had turned into someone he couldn't recognize. "You don't have to leave," I said softly, even though part of me wanted them to. "But if you do, leave knowing this: the woman you think just changed has been here all along." Lorraine scoffed again and grabbed her coat, muttering to herself about selfishness and secrets. They left in small clusters, murmuring amongst themselves, and I didn't follow them to the door. I sat in my chair, hands folded, listening to the front door close like the end of a chapter. Only Ethan remained, hovering in the hallway, looking torn between anger and guilt. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked, not accusingly this time, but almost like a son again. I looked up at him and let the silence breathe between us before I answered. "Because I knew it would change things," I said. "I knew it would change you." He opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. "Maybe you were right," he said at last. "But I still wish you trusted me." "I wish you had seen me before today," I whispered. He nodded once, slowly, and left without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, and I was alone again, but this time, I didn't feel abandoned. If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me. The house was quiet in the kind of way that made the air feel heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I sat there for a while, staring at the untouched pie, the flickering candles, and the empty chairs that just an hour ago held my family. They had come for a meal, but they left as strangers, their eyes colder than the leftovers. I stood up slowly, my knees aching from too long in one position, and blew out the candles one by one. The shadows returned to the corners of the room, wrapping around me like old memories I'd rather forget. I gathered plates and glasses in silence, not out of obligation but habit, because I had always been the one who cleaned up. The pie, still perfectly intact, looked like a joke now, sweet, soft, meant for celebration. I carried it into the kitchen, opened the trash bin, and dumped it in. It felt symbolic, like I was throwing away the last piece of pretending everything was fine. The click of the trash lid closing was the loudest sound in the room. I didn't cry, not then, not while wiping down countertops or stacking dishes in the sink. Tears seemed like a luxury I no longer believed in, or maybe I'd used them all up over the years when no one was watching. I moved like a ghost, barely touching the floor, my hands acting on autopilot while my mind drifted to darker places. There had been a time when I believed that love meant sacrifice, that giving more meant being loved more. But tonight had peeled that illusion from me like old wallpaper, revealing the bare wall of truth underneath. I wasn't loved for who I was, I had been loved for what I did. Cooking, babysitting, lending money, being convenient. The phone rang, breaking the silence, and I flinched like it had shouted my name. I dried my hands on a dish towel, hesitating before picking up, knowing exactly who it would be. "Hi, Mom," Ethan's voice came through softly, tentative like a boy calling from the principal's office. I didn't answer right away, letting the silence speak for me, letting him squirm for a second. I couldn't sleep, he continued, and I imagined him pacing in his hallway, rubbing the back of his neck like he always did when nervous. I kept thinking about everything you said tonight. Still, I didn't say anything, and I could almost hear his thoughts scrambling to fill the space. I'm sorry we made you feel like we only cared about the money, he finally said. I closed my eyes and whispered, "It's not a feeling, Ethan, it's a pattern." The line went quiet again, and this time, he didn't try to deny it. "I was proud of you," I said, finally breaking the silence. "When you got promoted, when you worked so hard. I planned this dinner to celebrate that, not to become a prize you all wanted to split." He sighed deeply, a sound full of shame, and I felt it stretch across the line like a hand reaching too late. "I know," he said quietly. "Melissa, she's ambitious, and sometimes that turns into entitlement." I shook my head, though he couldn't see me. "It wasn't just her, Ethan. You all looked at me like I'd committed a crime by being smart with my money." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "We did, didn't we?" I sat down at the kitchen table, the phone cradled between my shoulder and ear. "Yes, and it broke something in me I'm not sure I want to fix." "I don't want to lose you over this," Ethan said, his voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since he was 12. "Then don't," I replied, my words plain and unadorned. "But understand that if we go forward, it's not going to be the same." He was quiet for a beat, then asked, "What does that mean?" I leaned back in the chair, staring at the fridge covered in grandchildren's drawings and photos. "It means I'm going to live my life for me now, not for any of you." The silence on the other end was different this time, not wounded, but contemplative. "I think you should," he said at last, surprising me. "It's about time you did." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak again, and hung up without saying goodbye. The next morning, I awoke before dawn, the habit of decades pulling me from bed before the sun. But instead of heading straight to the kitchen, I sat at my desk and opened my old ledger, the one I used before I started using digital tools. Each page told a part of my story in numbers: the land in Vermont, the first stocks I bought, the down payments, the dividends, the quiet wins. I traced a finger down a column labeled Possibilities, filled with names of causes I'd considered donating to someday. It was a list I had guarded like a secret wish, unsure if I'd ever get to see it come to life. I added a new entry at the bottom of the page: Women's Housing Initiative, Safe Transitional Spaces for Women over 60. My pen hovered for a moment before I drew a star beside it. Then I pulled out my laptop and began researching directors, funding models, and how to set up a charitable endowment. For the first time in weeks, I felt the sharp joy of purpose. By noon, I had drafted 5 emails, 1 grant proposal, and made contact with a financial advisor I trusted. His name was Martin Chin, a quiet, methodical man I'd met through a workshop years ago at the library. I trusted him because he never tried to sell me anything. He listened, asked smart questions, and treated me like I wasn't just an old lady with a lucky streak. When he answered my call, his tone was just as warm and steady as I remembered. "Margaret, haven't heard from you in a while," he said. "What's the occasion?" "A new chapter," I said simply, and explained my intentions with a clarity that surprised even me. He didn't interrupt once, just took notes and occasionally hummed thoughtfully. When I finished, he said, "It's bold, it's beautiful, and it's going to change lives." I smiled. That's the goal. After we finalized a meeting for the following week, I closed my laptop and leaned back in the chair. Sunlight poured through the window, glinting off the glass jars on my kitchen shelves, dancing across the floor like approval. I thought of the faces around the table last night, the shock, the anger, the dismay, and I didn't feel regret. I felt release. They had revealed themselves to me in a way no inheritance or family brunch ever could. And in that clarity, I had found something even more precious than the money itself: autonomy. I stood up, poured myself a fresh cup of tea, and looked out the window at the garden I had built from compost and stubbornness. Maybe I wasn't just rewriting my legacy, maybe I was finally starting to live it. One choice at a time. And this time, every single one of those choices would belong to me. By the end of the week, I had finalized the formation of a charitable trust under my name, and it felt like breathing new air. Martin had walked me through every document patiently, never once speaking down to me like so many others had. He said I was one of the few clients who asked smarter questions than his corporate investors. I told him I had 40 years of figuring things out with limited tools. Now, with access and time, I had no excuse to stay quiet. The Women's Housing Initiative was officially born by Friday, with an initial allocation of $2 million. I sat on my porch that afternoon, sipping tea and watching the sky shift from blue to gold, feeling like I had quietly won something no one could take. My bank balance had decreased, but my dignity had doubled. For once, my wealth had a purpose that couldn't be split, claimed, or guilt away. It was mine, and I was choosing how it would echo beyond me. The wind smelled like honeysuckle and salt, and I finally understood what freedom meant. On Saturday morning, Lorraine showed up uninvited, knocking with the urgency of someone who had rehearsed her speech all the way over. I didn't answer right away, instead finishing my toast and making sure the kettle was turned off. When I opened the door, she was standing there with a forced smile and a tin of cookies she had clearly bought from the store. "I thought we could talk," she said, stepping inside before I even moved aside. I watched her survey the house like she was trying to reestablish dominance over a space that had never belonged to her. "I've been thinking," she began, sitting in my reading chair without asking. "About what you said, about being invisible." I raised an eyebrow, wondering where this performance was headed. "And?" I asked, sitting opposite her, arms folded, not offering tea. Lorraine exhaled sharply, placing the tin on the table like it was a peace offering. "I just think maybe we all misread the situation." "Miscalculated, you mean," I corrected, not letting her off the hook so easily. Her jaw tightened, but she recovered quickly, smoothing down her skirt and composing herself. "Look, Margaret, I'm not here to argue," she said, trying to make her voice sound warm. "I just think it would be a shame to let this money come between us." I stared at her, wondering if she realized the irony in her own words. "It didn't come between us, Lorraine," I replied, calm and clear. It revealed what was already there. She blinked, clearly not expecting me to be so blunt. "We've never been close, not really. You call when you need something, and when you don't, I'm just a name on your contact list." Lorraine's lips pursed, and I could see her struggling to keep her expression neutral. "That's not true," she said softly, but I didn't respond. The silence said more. She tried again, her voice laced with condescension this time. "I mean, let's be honest. What are you even going to do with all that money at your age?" The words stung not because they were cruel, but because they were so expected, so deeply rooted in her belief that age stripped me of value. "Invested in dignity," I said, not blinking. "Mine and other women's." She tilted her head like she didn't understand, like I was speaking in code. "What does that even mean?" I leaned forward slightly, letting her see that I wasn't intimidated by her presence in my home. "It means I've started a foundation," I said. "A program to provide housing for older women left behind by their families." Her face paled, and I saw the impact land exactly where I wanted it to. Because no woman should end her life feeling like a burden when she spent it being everyone else's strength. Lorraine stood abruptly, the tension in her shoulders betraying the calm she was trying to maintain. "So, you're just going to give it away?" she asked, her voice hard now, brittle with resentment. "Not all of it," I replied, standing too, so we were eye to eye. "But I'll give every cent to someone who needs it before I let it be treated like a prize." "That's insane," she snapped, grabbing her purse and the untouched cookie tin. "You're throwing away the family's future." I shook my head slowly, feeling no guilt, only certainty. "No, Lorraine. I'm throwing away the idea that I owe any of you my life's work just because you share my blood." Her mouth opened to argue, but no words came out, so she turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The tin rattled in her grip, unopened, uneaten, like her intentions. I sat back down, the quiet returning like an old friend, and for a moment I closed my eyes. I could still hear the echoes of her footsteps on the porch, fast and angry like a child denied dessert. My phone buzzed on the table, and I let it go to voicemail, not ready to hear anyone else's justifications or veiled threats. When I finally checked the message, it was from Colleen, her voice sugar-sweet and rehearsed. "Hi Margaret, I heard about the housing initiative. That's so inspiring. I was wondering if you'd consider a partnership opportunity for a community space. Darren and I have been planning." I deleted it without replying. They were still playing the same game, but I wasn't at the table anymore. They didn't understand that this wasn't a negotiation, it was a liberation. And I had no intention of returning to a prison I'd just escaped. By Sunday, word had spread throughout the family about the trust, the donations, and what I was calling my second life. Abigail, my youngest grandchild, texted me with a string of heart emojis and a message that read, "Grandma, I want to help with your foundation. Can I volunteer?" I smiled for the first time that day, letting her words sit gently in my heart. Abigail had always been different, observant, thoughtful, never quite buying into the performance the others put on during gatherings. I replied, "Of course, sweetheart. I'd be honored." Her response came instantly, "You're my hero." That meant more than anything Lorraine or Melissa could have offered wrapped in ribbon. I stood at the window, watching the birds gather at the feeder, thinking how even small creatures knew when to fly free. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of who I was becoming. I was finally becoming who I had always been. Monday arrived with an eerie calm, as if the world had pressed pause while the drama of my life played out in slow motion. I woke up early, not out of habit this time, but from a growing sense of anticipation I couldn't quite name. The sun poured through the curtains like an invitation, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had anything to clean, cook, or prove. I made coffee, strong and black, and sat by the window watching the neighborhood wake up. People jogged by with headphones, dogs sniffed lampposts, and life went on beautifully indifferent to my family's chaos. I hadn't heard from Ethan since our late-night phone call, and I wasn't surprised. He needed time to figure out who he was without leaning on the woman he used to assume would catch him. Melissa, I imagined, was spinning her wheels, searching for another angle or excuse, something polished in concern and dripping in calculation. Lorraine hadn't followed up, though I half expected her to send a letter filled with passive-aggressive scripture references. But instead, there was only quiet, the kind that felt like a clean slate. Around mid-morning, I received an email from Martin with the subject line, "Finalized, congratulations." I opened it with a strange sense of ceremony, reading through the legal confirmation that the Margaret Ellis Foundation for Women's Housing was now officially recognized and funded. I stared at my name at the top of the letterhead, printed in bold serif font, and felt a ripple of something deep and unfamiliar, pride without apology. My name, not Ethan's, not my late husband's, not anyone else's, stood alone. I printed it out and pinned it to the corkboard above my desk, right next to a faded photo of me holding Abigail as a newborn. I wanted her to see it someday, that transformation could look quiet and power didn't always shout. I replied to Martin with a thank you and asked about next steps for finding local housing partners. He responded within the hour, attaching a list of organizations I could interview and visit. For the first time since the gathering, I had a day full of things that mattered, and not one of them revolved around their approval. At noon, I received another message, this time a voicemail from Darren. "Mom, I know things got heated. I just want to talk. Can we do lunch? Just us." His tone was low, cautious, like a child trying to inch back into good graces. I stared at the phone for a full minute before hitting delete without listening further. The Darren I had seen at the table wasn't someone I wanted to meet over sandwiches and small talk. He had looked at me like a gold mine, not a mother, and that wasn't something lunch could undo. I walked into the garden and began trimming the marigolds, their scent sharp and earthy as I sheared away dead blossoms. Gardening had always helped me think it was honest work, with no room for manipulation. Flowers didn't pretend, and weeds didn't beg for forgiveness. You pulled what didn't belong, you nurtured what did, and you lived with the results. I would do the same with my life. Later that day, Abigail called me for the first time since texting, her voice brimming with excitement. "Grandma, I told my civics teacher about your foundation, and he wants you to come speak to our class." I blinked, surprised but moved, touched by the sincerity I heard in her tone. He said we never talk about elder women and independence. I told him you're like a superhero. I chuckled, the sound feeling light, almost strange in my own ears. A superhero with arthritis? I teased, and she laughed back, young and unbothered. No one needs perfect knees to change the world, she replied with that sharpness I had always admired. I agreed to visit her class next Friday and hung up with a heart fuller than it had been in weeks. In Abigail's eyes, I was still whole, maybe even more so than before. That evening, I received a letter in the mail, an actual envelope, addressed in stiff cursive handwriting I immediately recognized as Amy's. The note inside was brief, with no greeting and no signature, just 3 lines. If you think this makes you noble, you're wrong. Family should come first. You'll regret this. I folded the note, slid it back into the envelope, and threw it into the recycling bin without a second glance. Amy had always been Lorraine's echo, louder in judgment, quieter in effort. Her words didn't cut, they confirmed. What I had feared before as separation was now clarity, and I welcomed it like a breeze through an open window. I brewed a cup of herbal tea, lit a candle in the living room, and pulled out an old journal I hadn't touched since last winter. I began to write down every moment that had led me to this, not for them, but for me. By Wednesday, word had reached the broader community, not because I'd announced anything, but because people talk, and small towns don't need press releases. I got a call from a local radio host, asking if I'd be willing to do a short interview about the foundation. I agreed, not out of vanity, but because I wanted women like me to know they weren't alone. When the host asked what inspired me, I didn't say bitterness or revenge, I said, realizing that I was still here and still capable. That line made it into the highlight reel they played every hour that afternoon. Several women from the neighborhood dropped off notes in my mailbox afterward, thanking me, telling me their stories. One wrote, "My kids call me grandma and maid in the same breath. Thank you for reminding me I'm more than a to-do list." I cried when I read that one. Then I wrote back, not because I had to, but because it mattered. By Thursday night, I received a text from Melissa, the first since the gathering. "Can we start over?" I was just shocked. "You know I admire strong women, right?" I stared at the message, amazed at her ability to rebrand herself with emojis and fake warmth. She hadn't apologized, hadn't acknowledged the way she interrogated me like a criminal in my own home. She just wanted the slate wiped clean, no consequences, no discomfort. I didn't reply, but I didn't block her either. I wanted her to see my silence as a statement. That silence said more than any speech could, and I hoped it echoed. I knew she would show it to Ethan and spin a tale about how cold I'd become. Let her. I wasn't responsible for the stories they told themselves to sleep at night. I was too busy writing a new one of my own, one where I wasn't the footnote anymore. Friday morning, I arrived at Abigail's high school with a folder of notes, a pressed navy blouse, and a nervousness I hadn't felt in years. The school secretary greeted me kindly and offered coffee, which I declined, choosing instead to steady myself with slow breaths. Abigail met me just outside her classroom, her smile wide, her hands nervously fiddling with the sleeves of her sweater. "You look amazing, Grandma," she whispered, like I was royalty visiting her kingdom. Her teacher, Mr. Leon, was a young man with kind eyes and an eagerness I found both refreshing and mildly amusing. He introduced me with more enthusiasm than I felt I deserved, calling me a local trailblazer in community leadership. The students clapped politely, but I could tell most were just excited to delay the start of their quiz. Still, when I began speaking, not from the notes but from memory, the room softened. I told them about saving, not for wealth, but for freedom, and how easy it is to become invisible even when surrounded by people. And when I mentioned that I'd spent decades giving without ever asking what I deserved in return, a few heads lowered, and Abigail's eyes filled with tears. After the talk, 3 girls and a boy approached me, each thanking me for what I'd shared. One said her grandmother had just moved into a shared apartment because no one in her family wanted to take her in. Another told me she never thought about where women go when they've raised everyone and are left with nothing. I stayed for another 20 minutes answering questions and encouraging them to see age as power, not pity. When it was time to leave, Abigail hugged me tightly in the hallway, whispering, "I'm proud of you," into the fabric of my sleeve. I held her longer than necessary, suddenly overwhelmed by the contrast between her sincerity and the emptiness I'd seen in her parents' eyes. On the drive home, I cried, not from sadness, but from something older and deeper, recognition. For the first time in years, someone in my family saw me without needing something in return. I wasn't a wallet or a babysitter or a maid, I was just Margaret. And that, I realized, was enough. That afternoon, I received a bouquet of sunflowers at my doorstep, no note attached. I knew they were from Ethan. Sunflowers had been his apology language since he was a teenager. Still, I didn't bring them inside right away, unsure if they were meant to brighten my day or soften my defenses. I stood there staring at them for a moment, trying to decide if flowers meant anything after all that had happened. Eventually, I brought them into the kitchen, trimmed the stems, and placed them in a jar by the window. Their bright, stubborn petals made the whole room warmer, but I didn't let them mean more than they did. Gifts are not redemption, and gestures are not apologies. That evening, I received a voicemail from Ethan, just 5 words. "I hope the flowers helped." I didn't call back, but I didn't erase the message either. Let him sit with silence for once, the way I had sat in his for decades. On Saturday morning, I visited the office of the first organization on Martin's list, Haven Grove, a nonprofit that ran transitional housing for women aged 55 and up. Their director, Camille, was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 70s with a shock of silver curls and a grip like a vice. We talked for hours over tea in her office, swapping stories of small victories, bureaucratic nightmares, and the haunting loneliness of women discarded after their usefulness expired. "They used to run households," Camille said, gesturing to the photo wall of women in knit scarves and crooked smiles. "Now they sleep 3 to a room and wait for food stamps." I told her about the foundation, about my plans, about the money no one believed I'd earned. Her eyes didn't widen with greed, only gratitude. "Most people with that kind of wealth wouldn't touch women like us with a 10-foot pole," she said. I replied, "That's because most people don't know how easily they could become one of us." By the end of the meeting, we drafted a partnership proposal that would change everything. When I returned home, I found a letter from Melissa tucked under my doormat, the envelope thick and lined with embossed roses. I considered tossing it straight into the recycling, but curiosity won. Inside was a handwritten note in her looping, elegant script. "Margaret, I realize now I approached you from a place of fear, not love. Money reveals us. I didn't like what I saw in myself. If you ever choose to forgive me, I'm here." There was no request, no manipulation, and I'll admit, that surprised me. But I didn't trust it, not yet. People don't change in a week, they adjust. Still, I placed the letter in a drawer instead of the trash. I wasn't ready to forgive, but I also wasn't ready to discard the possibility. Later that week, Camille invited me to speak at a luncheon for their donors, and I accepted, despite my anxiety. The event was small but formal, filled with polished people who wore sympathy like jewelry, expensive and performative. I told my story anyway, not for them, but for the women watching from the sidelines with paper napkins in their laps and hope barely surviving behind their eyes. I told them about sacrifice, about invisibility, about being valued only when convenient. I spoke plainly, without metaphor, letting the truth do the heavy lifting. When I finished, there was no standing ovation, just silence, thick and respectful. Camille patted my shoulder and whispered, "They heard you, even if they don't clap." I believed her. That night, I sat alone in my living room with a bowl of soup and no television, just the quiet peace of a day lived on my own terms. It tasted better than any family dinner I'd hosted in the past decade. That night, Ethan called again, and this time I answered. "I don't want to fight," he said immediately, his voice sounding smaller than I remembered. "I just want to understand." I let out a breath and said, "Then stop trying to fix it. Just listen." And for once, he did. I told him about Haven Grove, about Camille, about the luncheon, about Abigail's classroom, about everything I'd done since they all walked out. He didn't interrupt, didn't sigh, didn't ask what it meant for him. When I finished, he said, "I'm proud of you, Mom. I really am." I wanted to believe him, needed to, but I still said nothing. Some silences were not wounds anymore. They were boundaries. If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me. Saturday bled into Sunday with little fanfare, the hours slow and heavy like thick syrup. I spent the morning sorting through old documents, not out of necessity, but as a way of revisiting the life that built the fortune everyone suddenly noticed. There were tax returns marked with careful notes, property deeds from neighborhoods no one believed I had known to buy into, and letters from my grandmother, who started it all with 5 acres and a whisper of possibility. Each paper was proof, not for them, but for me, that I'd earned every cent with patience, not luck. I stopped at an envelope filled with faded photographs of Ethan and Darren as children, sticky with years and sentiment. One showed Ethan asleep on my chest in a rocking chair, the same chair now gathering dust in the corner of the guest room. I ran my thumb over the image and wondered when he had last leaned on me without expectation. They had once been mine, my boys, before they grew into men who learned to measure love in dollars and favors. I folded the picture carefully and returned it to the envelope, tucking it back into the drawer with everything else I had learned to protect. Then I stood, stretched, and went to water the garden. Around midday, I heard the sound of tires crunching the gravel of my driveway. I looked out the window and saw Frank, my cousin on my mother's side, who hadn't visited in 3 years, stepping out of his SUV in khakis too tight for comfort. He held a gift bag in one hand and wore the kind of smile you see on real estate billboards. I opened the door but didn't invite him in, choosing instead to stand squarely on the porch, arms crossed. "Margaret," he said, grinning like I was the solution to his mortgage. "Thought I'd swing by while I was in town, brought you something." "You never just swing by," I replied, my tone flat. He laughed awkwardly and held out the gift bag, which contained a candle labeled Ocean Breeze and a bottle of wine I was sure he'd regifted. "Mind if we chat a bit?" he asked, already stepping forward. "That depends," I said, not moving. "Is this visit about me, or about my bank account?" His expression cracked, but he recovered with a shrug. "Just wanted to catch up," he said, as if I couldn't see the calculation in his eyes. I stepped aside only because I didn't want the neighbors to hear whatever this was about. Inside, he looked around as if cataloging the furniture, the art, the square footage, and I suddenly felt invaded. I poured us both water, not wine, and sat down at the head of the table, the seat I used to give up. "So," he began, "I heard about your foundation. Very impressive." "Thank you," I said, offering nothing more. "Makes me think," he continued, "about how we should be looking out for our own too, you know?" I leaned back slightly. "Our own family, Margaret," he said with a wink that made my stomach turn. I let the silence sit long enough that he started to squirm in his chair. "You know, we've all had our tough patches," he went on, fidgeting with his napkin. "My business took a hit last quarter. Economy's brutal out there." I tilted my head, watching him carefully. "And?" "Well, I was thinking maybe you could help," he said, finally dropping the act. "Just a little cushion, a loan, really. I'll pay you back as soon as we turn things around." "A loan," I repeated, not masking the disbelief in my voice. "Like the one I gave you in 2009? His face stiffened. "That was different." "It always is," I said, standing up to signal the conversation's end. "Frank, you haven't checked on me in years. You didn't come when I had the flu, you didn't send a card when George died, and you certainly didn't care what I was building until you heard the number." He stood too, red in the face, trying to pivot but failing. "It's not like that, Margaret. We're blood, we should help each other." "I have helped," I replied, walking him to the door. "Just not in the way you want." "You'll regret this," he said, not with menace, but with the certainty of someone who thinks access is a right. "I regret thinking you came for me and not for what I had," I replied. He left without shaking my hand, the gift bag still on the table where he'd placed it. I dropped it in the trash the second he pulled out of the driveway, then washed my hands like I'd touched something dirty. There was no satisfaction, just the hollow ache of another relationship stripped bare. I made a note in my journal that night. Today I closed another door. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. Monday brought a new letter, this one from Colleen, thick, folded 3 times and written in pencil, as if she thought I might erase it. Margaret, it began, we've all been talking, and while emotions ran high, we feel it's time to find a solution that benefits everyone. I stopped reading it solution, recognizing it as code for compromise, not theirs, but mine. I didn't finish the letter, but I didn't tear it up either. Instead, I opened a blank sheet of paper and wrote one sentence: "My money is not your family plan." I folded it neatly and mailed it back in the same envelope. If they couldn't hear me speak, maybe they'd read the silence between my words. I spent the rest of the day preparing for my second meeting with Haven Grove. Camille had invited 2 other women from the board, and I wanted to be ready. These were people who built futures, not fantasies. I was choosing them now over anyone who thought sharing my blood meant inheriting my worth. The board meeting at Haven Grove was held in a modest community room attached to a local library, with folding chairs and a coffee station that smelled of burnt filters and effort. Camille greeted me at the door with her usual firm handshake, introducing me to Ruth and Nadira, 2 women who had been part of the nonprofit since its inception. Ruth was quiet, analytical, her notebook already half-filled before the meeting began. Nadira had a booming laugh and sharp eyes, and when I mentioned the resistance I'd faced from my own family, she patted my arm and said, "Welcome to the club." We sat in a loose circle, talking through expansion plans, budgeting, outreach strategy, and how to keep our dignity while asking for money from people who had more than enough. They listened when I spoke, not the polite listening of people waiting for their turn, but true listening. I brought up a potential site near the outskirts of town, an abandoned church building with good bones and a flat lot. Ruth immediately pulled up the zoning records on her tablet, while Nadira jotted down names of contractors who might offer discounts for women-led projects. For the first time in a long time, I felt like my mind had a seat at the table, not just my checkbook. That night, I returned home to find a voicemail blinking on my phone again, Ethan, for the 3rd time that week. I sat on the edge of my bed, pressing play more out of curiosity than expectation. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot," he began, his voice steady but stripped of the entitlement it had carried weeks earlier. "About how we treated you. About how I treated you." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I know an apology isn't enough, but I also know it's the only place I can start." He sounded tired, maybe even changed, but I wasn't ready to trust softness just yet. "Melissa's been going to counseling," he added, almost like a confession. "She said the way she reacted wasn't about you. It was about how she's always tied security to control." I didn't delete the message, but I didn't return the call either. Growth takes time, and I had already spent most of my life waiting on other people's timelines. Tuesday morning, I walked the potential site with Camille, Ruth, and Nadira, the crunch of weeds beneath our shoes like paper being ripped from old ledgers. The building was dusty and stained, but the structure was sound, thick beams, solid foundation, and a layout that could easily accommodate 10 private rooms, a common kitchen, and a garden out back. "It smells like mold and regret," Nadira said, laughing, and I found myself laughing with her. Camille took photos with her phone while Ruth marked measurements, already dreaming of walls we hadn't even raised. I stood in the doorway for a long time, imagining women moving through this space, unpacking boxes, brewing tea, opening books they had never had time to read. I pictured birthday candles and radio music and slippers on hardwood floors. "It's not perfect," I said. "Neither are we," Camille replied. "But we're still here." We agreed to submit a bid by Friday. That afternoon, I received an envelope with a courthouse return address, an official summons for a mediation request filed by Darren and Colleen. My stomach sank, but only for a moment. I knew they were bluffing, hoping that formal paperwork would scare me into meeting them at their table. The document outlined their claim that I had become mentally impulsive and was dismantling family equity through erratic asset divestment. The words made me laugh out loud, sharp and bitter, until I had to sit down. I called Martin, who assured me that my financial decisions were airtight, legally protected, and fully within my rights. "They can request all they want," he said, "but they'll get nothing more than your voicemail." I emailed a scanned copy to Camille just to be safe. She replied with 3 words, "Let them try." I put the letter in the same drawer as Melissa's note and Frank's failed charm, each one a relic of people who mistook love for leverage. Then I went into the backyard and pulled weeds until my hands ached. That evening, I decided to call Abigail, not out of obligation, but because I missed her voice. She picked up on the second ring, breathless from a run or dance rehearsal. I couldn't tell which. "Grandma," she said, as if no time had passed, as if love didn't need cleanup. We talked about her classes, her teacher's odd obsession with vintage political posters, and the new stray cat that had taken up residence behind the gym. She didn't mention her parents, and I didn't ask. We both knew that subject was a cliff with no bridge. "Are you still coming to my choir recital next week?" she asked, hope laced in her voice. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," I said. "Even if your parents are there?" she asked softly. I paused, then said, "Especially if they are." I could almost hear her smiling on the other end. Wednesday brought more press interest. A small piece in the regional newsletter had mentioned my foundation, and now a local TV station wanted a quick interview. I hesitated, not wanting the attention, but Camille encouraged it. "People listen to faces more than they read mission statements," she said. "And yours says exactly what we're trying to do." So I agreed. A young woman named Tara came with a camera, a clipboard, and nervous energy, setting up in my garden with natural light. I wore my blue cardigan and let my silver hair fall the way it wanted to. When Tara asked, "What do you hope to achieve with this foundation?" I looked straight into the lens and said, "I want women who gave everything to be able to keep something, their homes, their dignity, their peace." That clip would later go semi-viral on the local station's website. But in that moment, it was just the truth, spoken clearly, without permission or apology. That night, the house was quiet again, but not empty. I made myself a simple dinner, baked salmon and steamed carrots, and poured a glass of wine I'd been saving for no reason. I sat by the window with my plate in my lap, the news muted on the television, and the garden just visible through the sheer curtains. A raccoon wandered through the flower bed, sniffed a gnome, and shuffled off like a tiny burglar. I laughed to myself, the sound unguarded, and realized I hadn't felt this light in years. No one knew where I would go next or what I would do with the money they'd already claimed in their minds. And that's what made it mine. I toasted the night, the gnome, the raccoon, and the version of myself who had finally learned to stop shrinking. This peace, I knew now, was not given, it was claimed. By Thursday, the bid on the old church property had been accepted, and the keys were scheduled to transfer the following week. Camille called with a voice full of restrained joy, the kind that comes from winning something that once felt impossible. "It's really happening," she said, and I heard Nadira cheering in the background. I sat in my kitchen, coffee in hand, staring out at the garden I'd spent years growing, and whispered to myself, "It's really happening." For so long, my life had revolved around maintaining peace, smoothing over tension, and swallowing hurt for the sake of appearances. Now, I was planting something that would grow long after I was gone, and it was rooted in honesty, not fear. We finalized the construction schedule that evening, and I volunteered to oversee the community garden once the residents moved in. Ruth suggested naming the program after someone, perhaps my grandmother, whose land sale had started it all. But I shook my head and said softly, it should carry the name of every woman who was told her best years were behind her. We settled on the Second Bloom project, and when Camille wrote it on the board, we all sat in quiet awe. Friday morning brought an unexpected knock at the door, not urgent like Lorraine's or smirking like Frank's, but hesitant. I opened it to find Ethan alone, holding nothing, no flowers, no bags, no smile. He looked tired, but not performative, not like someone who wanted to win, but like someone who had finally stopped keeping score. "Can I come in?" he asked. I nodded and stepped aside, and we walked together into the kitchen like it was the first time. He sat down slowly, his eyes scanning the familiar room, but not with the hunger of inheritance, more like memory. "This used to feel bigger," he said, running a hand through his hair. "You were smaller," I replied, and we both let out a breath that wasn't quite laughter. "I don't want anything," he said next, meeting my eyes. I just need to say some things that should have been said years ago. Pressure he'd felt to provide, to maintain appearances, to keep Melissa happy even when it bent him out of shape. When she saw the bank balance on your phone, it scared her, he admitted. She saw freedom and assumed it meant she'd be cut out. I tilted my head slightly, unsure if that was a confession or a defense. And you? I asked. I saw it and realized I'd never really known you, he answered. I saw the money and felt betrayed, not because you had it, but because I never asked how you got there. The silence after his words wasn't cold, it was a wound beginning to close. I nodded, still cautious, but softening. Thank you for saying that, I told him. I'm not proud of how I acted, he said. But I'm trying to be proud of what I do next. I listened as he told me about the counseling he and Melissa had started, not to fix their marriage, but to understand why they saw control as comfort. She's not the villain, he said, but she's also not the woman I thought she'd be in a storm. I said nothing to that, some truths didn't need comment, only time. He asked about Abigail, and I told him she was thriving, her voice stronger than ever. She's watching us, I said plainly. How we handle this will shape who she becomes. Ethan looked down, then back up, and nodded. Then I want to do better, even if it takes the rest of my life. We talked until late afternoon, mostly about things that didn't hurt: movies, books, old neighbors, the treehouse he and Darren had once fallen out of. It wasn't a clean slate, but it was a start, and that was more than I'd expected to ever get. Before he left, he stood in the doorway, hand resting on the frame like he used to when he was 15 and didn't know how to apologize. I know the money's not mine, he said. I really do. I nodded. It never was, I replied. But you still are, if you choose to be. He blinked fast, then smiled with a softness I hadn't seen since he was a boy. He left without asking for anything, and for the first time, I believed him. That night, I stood in the garden with a cup of mint tea, the stars bright above me and the wind carrying the smell of jasmine across the yard. I thought of all the dinners I had cooked, the favors I had granted, the smiles I had worn like armor. I thought of the casseroles and phone calls and birthdays where I was more caterer than guest. I thought of the woman I used to be: quiet, agreeable, grateful for crumbs. And then I thought of this woman, standing in her own backyard, not waiting to be invited, but building her own house entirely. A house where no one needed to earn rest, where no one's worth was decided by usefulness. The wind shifted, cool and strong, and I knew that whatever came next, I could face it without flinching. I raised my cup to the sky, whispered, "Let them say what they want," and drank to the woman I had become. The following week, the local news ran a short segment about the Second Bloom project, featuring clips from the interview and a few shots of the site renovation in progress. I watched from my living room, Abigail curled beside me, her sketchbook resting on her knees. "That's you," she said with a proud grin. "That's us," I corrected, and she laughed. The footage ended with my voiceover. Sometimes, your second life begins when you stop asking permission to live it. The screen faded to black, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of things growing. The foundation had a waiting list before the paint was even dry. Camille texted me a photo of the first room furnished: a small bed, a warm quilt, a shelf of books, and a window that let in morning sun. I looked at the photo and felt no regret, no ache, only peace. Not because I had given everything away, but because I had finally kept something for myself, my future. Thank you for listening to my story. Before you leave, there's another story similar to the one you just watched. You'll see it on the top left of your screen.